we're going to focus now on Module 5. And remember, if you recall from this morning, so those first 4 modules are really meant to be a little bit more basic, that you don't need to have specialized economic training or advanced economic training. Once we get to Module 5, we're really into more of the meat of the economic pieces. So we all know this, right? We work in the food system. We know that there are complex linkages in the food system, right? So we have lots of different supply chain relationships. And we know when we talk about local and regional food systems that those supply chain relationships look a little bit different than they do in the global supply chain, right? It's a complex web of linkages. And it's understanding these linkages that help us to actually figure out what the economic impact is of some kind of food system initiative or a change in these food systems and how they operate. So let's imagine this in the top left corner here. This is the logo of the Farmers Market Promotion Program. So let's imagine that there's $1 million. You're not going to get $1 million, but let's just pretend that there's $1 million that comes in from the Farmers Market Promotion Program, so from the USDA, into a food hub in North Carolina. Right? And right now, when we're going to talk about local, I'm just going to talk about North Carolina as local, just to be simple about it. So we have $1 million that's going to come into this food hub to support this food hub and to increase the sales capacity of this food hub. This $1 million is the direct effect. So what we call this is a shock from the USDA, right? We call this a shock. It comes in, that's $1 million, the direct effect. So you don't really need to do any work to figure this out, right? Because we know what the grant was for. That's $1 million, easy peasy. In order to produce the products that it's going to sell, in order to have something to sell, the food hub is going to have to make purchases. It's going to purchase product from farmers. It's going to purchase product from processors. It's going to purchase product from, maybe it's going to rent a vehicle, or maybe it's going to buy a vehicle. It's going to purchase utilities. It may rent space, right? It has all of these different purchases it's going to make. Some of those purchases, but not all, are going to happen in the local economy, so they're going to happen in North Carolina. Those purchases that happen in North Carolina, those are called the indirect effects. And I want to just say that it's not just what the food hub is going to purchase, but in order to produce carrots that it's going to sell to the food hub, that farm is also going to have to purchase products, right? And some of the farm's purchases are going to be in the local economy as well. So you can see when we talk about these supply chain linkages, because we have this $1 million that's coming into the local economy, there are going to be a ripple effect of purchases that happen in the local economy beyond that $1 million, right? From other industries. So there's going to be other impacts along the supply chain. In addition, this food hub is going to have employees to work there, right? To actually produce what it's going to sell. And those employees are going to be paid wages, and they're going to spend some of those wages in the North Carolina economy. They're going to also purchase utilities. They may rent a house, or they may buy a house. They're going to purchase childcare for their children. They're going to buy groceries, et cetera, et cetera. Those local purchases, so how those wages are spent in the economy, those are the induced effects. And remember, it's not just the wages that the households spend, but then the grocery store, in order to have product to sell, it needs to make purchases, right? So we have this growing complexity and this strengthening. I shouldn't say it doesn't necessarily have to be complex, but we have this strengthening of linkages that happen. So when we talk about the total value of the local economic impact or the multiplier impact, what we have to calculate are the direct plus the indirect plus the induced impacts. So the direct impact is that shock. Here I'm talking about a positive shock, but that shock can be negative. Right? When people talk about negative shocks, they're usually from like a hurricane or some kind of natural disaster. So we have a shock that happens, and because of that shock, it's going to change the purchases that happen or how businesses are linked in the local economy. And that is what we do when we try to calculate local economic impact. It's really important to understand this concept because it's going to kind of motivate the rest of the day. So let's talk about this. Who has some questions about what the multiplier is and what we mean?
Say what the induced effect again was. That was like how you choose to spend the money, like whether it's on rent, you said.
Yeah. So the question is, what is induced effect? And so the induced effect is how wages, households, essentially, are spending their money in the local economy. So the indirect really refers to businesses or industries, and then the induced really refers to household wages.
And I often call the induced the household effect.
Okay, so Dave said he often calls the induced the household effect. Any other questions about this? We'll give a few more examples, but this is a really important piece. So we can measure these, we call them interregional linkages, so these inter-industry linkages, using input-output analysis. So this is the modeling method that economists use, that regional economists use, to measure the strength of these multipliers. So the multiplier, again, is that direct plus indirect plus induced effect. And you know, I got into this because before I went back to grad school, I worked in a county extension office in New York. I was one of the first agricultural economic development specialists in New York State and working for Cornell Cooperative Extension. And so I used to go to all the county planning meetings and talk to these elected officials, and I realized that the language that they used was talking about the multiplier. And I realized that there were very, very few people who were actually calculating the multiplier impact of these kinds of food system initiatives, right? So we use it all the time. We talk about putting in a new manufacturing business. We haven't done enough of this work in food systems. So we've come a long way since I was in the county office. So we want to be clear that when we calculate these multipliers, this is a term we use when we're doing economic impact assessment. But economic impact assessment is different than talking about economic growth or economic development. So we just want to spend a minute to make sure that we're clear about these terms. So economic growth is a dynamic concept that looks at change over a period of time, right? So we talk about economic growth as economic expansion. So economic growth, a community can experience economic growth if you have one firm, one business that grows, right? It doesn't tell you anything about the distribution. It just talks about, it's a number talks about your region has experienced growth. Development is very different, right? Because development is more value laden. It talks about improvement relative to some starting condition. So if we talk about, like, if our community has a goal of wanting to increase the number of small farms, or it wants to reduce economic disparity or economic inequality, right? Those are development concepts. Is that clear to folks, the difference between economic growth or economic development? So growth is relatively easy to measure, right? We talk about GDP, for example. That's economic growth. It's relatively easy to measure. Economic development can be a little bit more challenging, and again, it's really values driven a lot of the time. What is your community value? What's the change that you want to see? What's the improvement you want to see in your community? We're all good on those, the difference between those concepts? Impact, on the other hand, is associated with a specific event or change in behavior. And this is the focus of our toolkit and the focus of what we're talking about today. So again, going back to, we have a shock. We have an injection of money into our local economy. We got $1 million to support a food hub. Our community is going to build a new processing facility. We have a hurricane that disrupts the supply chain, right? These are specific events that we can measure at a given point in time, and we can look at what the impact is. So what we don't really do in this toolkit is to talk about economic growth or economic development. So it's important to think about, because when your community is starting this process, when you're putting together a food plan or you're trying to think about how to evaluate the impact of your work, this toolkit is going to help you with pieces in terms of thinking about the economic impacts of the work you're doing. It's going to help you think about calculating that multiplier. What it's not going to do is help you to figure out, whether or not the condition of low-income households or underserved communities is improved. We don't do that in this toolkit. It's something that's really important and needs to be done, and there are people who are doing pieces of it, but I want to be really clear about that. So anyway, the rest of today is really going to focus on this economic impact piece. So if you want to think about the impact of local food, one way to frame this is really in terms of import substitution. So we already have a supply chain, right? Forget about our local food system for a second. We already have a supply chain that exists, and that supply chain, that food system supply chain, generates local economic impact. If you shop at the grocery store in your community, it doesn't matter if you're shopping at Walmart, wherever you're shopping, that has local economic impact, right? Walmart is making local purchases. They're purchasing utilities as just one example. They're paying rent, or they're building something. They're hiring local employees. So all of that has local economic impact. They may not be purchasing the goods that they're selling in that store from a lot of local sources. And so essentially where the impact that comes from local and regional food system initiatives comes from is through this import substitution. So we're saying for this grocery store or at another place where people are shopping, instead of purchasing oranges from Florida, now we're going to have peaches from North Carolina. Does that make sense to everybody? Farmers markets can be thought of in a similar kinds of way, because now you're going to say, well, we're going to purchase some of our, as households who live in this community, we're going to make some of our food purchases at a local farmers market from local farms rather than maybe from the Walmart where they're getting those items that are not local. So it's an import substitution. Instead of importing these goods, we're going to purchase them from local sources. And the idea behind this import substitution is that as we make more local purchases, we strengthen those inter-industry linkages. So we create opportunities now for maybe supply chain businesses, local supply chain businesses that may not have existed, as an example, right? A food hub exists to facilitate better supply chain linkages locally, right? And I'm guessing everybody in this room knows Food Hub, right? We all work in food systems. Okay, great. So here's another multiplier example, right? So let's say, see on the left here we have this dollar. So let's say that you go out and you decide that you are going to spend $1 purchasing a product from your local grocery store. So you spend $1 purchasing that product from that grocery store. So now that grocery store has your $1, right? So that grocery store is going to essentially re-spend that $1 in the local community to some extent, and then they're going to make purchases from outside the local community to some extent. So the red is what we call leakage. That's the money that they're going to basically, that's a piece of your $1 that they're going to spend on purchases from outside of your local area, so from outside of North Carolina. The 40 cents in that blue is what they're going to re-spend locally, again on things like utilities, or they're going to spend it on labor or other pieces like that. But that 60 cents are things that they have to buy outside in North Carolina for whatever reason. So they've re-spent that 40 cents locally now on those things we mentioned, utility or employment. And in turn, the utility company or the people who work there are going to re-spend some of that money locally, and then some of it they're going to spend on things like from Amazon. So again, they're going to spend of that 40 cents, now 16 cents of it, and that blue is going to be re-spent in North Carolina, and 24 cents of that is going to leave the local economy. So now we have that initial direct effect of $1. We have 40 cents that was then re-spent in the next round locally, and we have another 16 cents that was spent locally, right? And of that 16 cents, pieces of that are going to continue to be spent locally, and pieces of it are going to continue to leave. So does everybody understand when we calculate the multiplier, what we're essentially doing is adding up those blue pieces? Now, the piece of it that I should have said that complicates it a little bit, we're not going to spend too much time going into this, is that it's not actually what you spend at the grocery store, because you want to see that shock coming in. So it's really sort of that new spending that's going to come in. But does everyone make sense? So that's the multiplier. So we have to understand how spending changes based on this new initiative or the new injection, the shock that's coming into the system. So we're good? I've like beat the multiplier what it is. We're good? Okay.
When you talk about shock, to me, I take that as something not good, but shock can be positive or negative.
Yeah, so the question is if shock sounds negative, does it have to be negative? Nope, so shocks can be positive or negative. So, as I was saying, that shock can be, we don't have to call it a shock, this is just kind of the jargon we use, so it's some kind of injection, right? The purpose that the Farmers Market Promotion Program exists is to stimulate more of these local inter-industry linkages, right? But specifically in this case to create new linkages between especially small, mid-scale, veteran, beginning farmers and the supply chain or households and those kinds of folks.
So you're thinking, in this context of these assessments, it's really like grant money would be a common shock.
So I think for people who work in the food system, that is often a common shock, right? Because we know this $1 billion has gone in. But there can be other shocks. So agritourism, right? Say we have a new, I'm in Colorado, but you guys are in North Carolina. We have all these shared breweries now, right? So we have a new brewery that's built in the local community. That can be a shock, right? And the purpose, because that brewery, it's going to get some local dollars, but it's going to bring in some outside money. Right? It's going to have people, it's a destination. So people are going to come, they're going to travel to North Carolina because they want to go and taste some new Belgian beer. Yeah.
So then you have to also, though, take into account negative shocks.
Yes. And we are going to spend some time talking about that in a minute here. Yep. It's very important. Yeah.
So a loan would also be considered a positive shock as well.
So loans are a little bit more complicated because if you think about it, a loan is, it's essentially an advance on resources that you're going to spend. The way to think about the shock is that it really needs to come from outside of your local community. So, so it's a little more complicated. Let's have a conversation about that one at the break, if that's okay. But a loan, generally speaking, especially in this kind of context, I wouldn't use a loan as a shock. Okay, so we talked about the input-output models. So this is the tool, the modeling tool that most people use to do these economic impact assessments. And what's interesting about input-output models, and I'm just going to touch on this, and Dave's going to go into it a lot more later this afternoon, is that input-output models, you can get, the data is available through a company called InPlan, but also from other sources, to have a complete picture of your economy. So it basically sets up a table that says we have all of these industries in the economy, and the industries are both buying things and they're selling things. And what it's saying is these are the people these are the industries that they're selling to, and these are the industries they're buying from. And so it's really nice because you can essentially have a complete picture of all of these linkages that exist in your local economy. So if you start with that kind of picture, then you can analyze, well, what happens? What's the ripple effect of some kind of shock that comes in? And so as I said, most analysts use InPlan for their input-output analysis because of its ease of operation. But this also has sort of an asterisk next to it. It's very easy to use, and so anybody who doesn't really know much about the assumptions that go into it can produce a number. And that's why, in part, there are so many bad studies out there. And this is taped, so it's okay. The world's going to know me. I'm saying this. But that's why, and we're going to talk about this, that if you see a study and they're not transparent somewhere in that study with what their methods are and what their assumptions are, you should not use it. You shouldn't repeat those numbers. We also get the question a lot about why we're using InPlan if we're trying to promote InPlan. InPlan, there are other software and data sources you can use. InPlan is what's most commonly used. Example I like to give is that when we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, in the recession, that this was chosen, InPlan was chosen by the U.S. government to actually understand what the economic impacts were of that investment. So it's a reputable source. Okay. So in terms of defining your study area, one of the pros and cons of doing these kind of quantitative models and doing an economic impact assessment is you have to draw really clear bounds on what is your local study area, right? You can't have this nebulous definition because you're going to have what's included as local, and that's going to be included in your shot and in the linkages piece and in calculating your multiplier. What's excluded is not part of that. So we talk a lot about how to define your local area. This goes back to this morning's question. In the toolkit, we advise using the concept of a functional economic area. And so this is sort of a semi-self-sufficient economic unit, and you want to take into account where people live, where people work. So this idea of a commute shed, where do people do most of their shopping? There could be other physical characteristics you want to consider. So really, where are people commuting? Where are they doing most of their grocery shopping? Where do their kids go to school? Thinking about those kinds of things. Keeping in mind the realities of data is available based on these political bounds. In-plan data is available at the zip code level, but we don't recommend going below a county level. The data is just not very good when you get below the county level. But there's times, and I know it's hard, especially as someone who worked in a county extension office for a number of years, sometimes it's hard to sell why you would want to do one of these assessments broader than the county level, especially, my funding at that point came from the county. But there are reasons why you want to do it, and I think using this kind of functional economic area or an MSA definition, that you can actually make a good rationale for why you want to do that. So reasonable size of multipliers. We have seen lots of studies that try to get the largest multiplier possible. I would say in general, if you see a multiplier that's larger than 2, so this, remember, it's the direct plus the indirect plus induced effect. If you see a multiplier that's larger than 2, you really want to question that study. Multipliers are not usually larger than 2. So if you see a multiplier of 7, there's something wrong with that study. Your goal should not be to get the largest multiplier possible. Multipliers are going to be bigger in urban places than they're going to be in rural places. And if you think about it intuitively based on what we've been talking about, it really makes sense. There are more businesses from which to purchase product in an urban place. So urban people can buy more of their products locally because there's just more there than in a rural place, right, where you might just have a small grocery store and you can't get everything you want there. You have to go somewhere else to buy products. So if our goal, if we made decisions, if we made these economic development decisions or these planning decisions based on the largest multiplier, we wouldn't build anything in rural places. So that can't be, this is not a substitute for a feasibility study either, right? So our goal should not be to get the largest multiplier effect. So there's 2 things that generally drive the size of the multipliers: the level of inter-industry linkages, and this is why I'm saying we have more of those inter-industry linkages in urban places than rural, and the size of the economy. Again, the economies in urban places are bigger than in rural places. So does that make sense to everybody? Okay, and here's a nice graphic illustrating it. So as you're going to get larger multipliers with stronger economic linkages and larger economy. There are lots of assumptions that go into these input-output models, and the assumptions are similar, in input-output models and in-plan. And you want to keep these assumptions in mind. So I'm not going to go through all of the assumptions today because we don't really have time. But what you understand is that, number one, there's no demand constraint, right? So if you have some kind of shock that comes in-plan is going to assume that there's enough demand that whatever is produced is going to be consumed. We know that this assumption is not true, right? Just because you build it, they may not come. So these are really important things to keep in mind. There's fixed prices. So we know in agriculture this is not true, right? Prices are going to go like this. So you want to keep that in mind. This is a static model. It also assumes that, say you have something that happens that's going to make your farms get bigger. Generally in agriculture, what happens when farms get bigger? They could operate more efficiently, but they mechanize, right? So they have different relationships with industries because now they're purchasing more equipment, or they have to repair the equipment, and they may be purchasing less labor not in terms of total, but in terms of as a percentage of expenditure. So that's going to change. That's going to change those inter-industry linkages. Does that make sense to everybody? So you really have to think about what's happening, what your shock is doing. Generally speaking, this kind of model makes more sense if you have a marginal change in your economy. So it's a smaller change. If you have something that completely changes some sector, this modeling tool is not really going to work for you. I'll just give you one other example of that. When I worked in New York State, we had a very small beer industry. I'm sorry I'm using beer again. That's not good. Anyway, we had a small beer industry, and we had no hops production. When I started in New York State, we had 10 acres of hops growing. We had no malting facilities. It really just didn't exist. And so we wanted to do an economic impact assessment of what happens now that we have this beer industry. Well, this industry is completely new, right? We had some breweries, but we've had tremendous growth. I mean, 800% in the number of hops and the hops production, and then these malting facilities, and then the breweries and all of this kind of stuff. You can't really get at that kind of change very easily within this kind of model because you basically have a whole new sector in the economy. Or you have to really go in and build those linkages. So anyway, I'm not going to talk today about how you would do that, but just to understand that those marginal changes are better modeled in this kind of framework than a huge change that's going to completely change the system. Okay, so we're going to move on to this. But does anyone have any questions about some of these basic economic concepts? Or Dave, is there anything you wanted me to add to that? You're good? Yeah.
When you were getting 16 cents, 20 cents off.
Yeah.
Is that built into this in-plan?
Yes, exactly. So that's exactly what's built in. So not each of those steps along the chain, but what it's going to give you is the multiplier, and it's going to show you those linkages. So it's going to say, for me, let's think of a good example. I'm a distributor. In order for that dollar of sales that I'm going to have, these are the things that I need to buy. And this is the amount that's purchased from local industry versus non-local industry. Is that, now you want to add that? Yeah.
And just quick,
Yeah.
I'm going to show people how this happens this afternoon. If you hang around, I'll show you.
Yeah. So get out at lunch. You don't want to stay around for that. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
The secret is no carbs at lunch. So
Yeah, no carbs. Protein. Yeah.
I'll just wait.
Okay, yeah. And really, Dave has a great way of showing this. We're not going to use in-plan, but he uses some of the in-plan data within Excel. So it's a really as a straightforward way to sort of see some of these changes and what you can do with these data.
Benchmark to some reliable indicators, both the 2012 ag census and other ag data, to do a better job. They actually had me test it last year and see how well it reconciled with other data at the county and at the state level. And they kind of missed a long ways, and they didn't miss a long ways in other things, and we went iteratively. So they're trying to get it to be better, but they're very self-conscious, and so you look at it with a grain of salt. So I always tell people, if you don't like what you see there at the county level, get to the ag census data and see if you can't put together a better data set, because you can modify it.
Yeah, in-plan data is very easy to modify. Yeah, but I mean, in-plan is trying to continue to improve their data, but they don't go collect any data themselves. So they're stuck with what we have access to.